I don't know, the idea was maybe to ask Olivier to give a few, to react on some of the main ideas, or at least some of the ideas that were put forward by Professor Mohamedou, and maybe to do this in a kind of, not question and answers, but maybe comment, so that we can this way introduce broader debates with the participants. I don't know whether you want to start like this, if it's fine for you. Yeah.
I think I will make some remarks, and then we start an informal debate. Needless to say, I have the book in high regard. It's a very interesting book on ISIS and very documented, you know. And as I would say, it's a bit out of the current polemics, because most of the polemics we have about ISIS and terrorism are precisely based on a lot of prejudices. So I fully agree, you know, that the problem is that terrorism, ISIS in general, is analyzed through the lenses of security, of think tank approach, as Mahmoud used to say, and that we have the problem of the theological prejudice, you know, the idea that the answer of the problem are in the Quran and so on. So, and it's a sheer loss of time, which led to, you know, this kind of stupid concept like de-radicalization, which is, by the way, totally new in the Western tradition. De-radicalization in the Chinese communist tradition, it was re-education. We had, yes, in the past, we have a model of de-radicalization. It was the Inquisition, of the Catholic Inquisition, how to de-hereticize, you know, if you can say that, an heretic, and so. But in the modern, you know, Western democratic tradition, it didn't exist, you know. The problem is that most of our policymakers are still working on this kind of concept. I will go now to, I would not call that disagreement, but maybe a different approach or a quest for clarifications. Clearly, and I think we agree on that, there are two, ISIS is a two-dimensional political object, and I agree it's a political object. You have the local and regional conditions, and you have the global mobilization. And for me, it's really different. You know. We can explain or understand the rise and the success of ISIS in the Iraq-Syrian area through the local history. Yeah. That's sure that at the beginning you have the Sykes-Picot agreement, or what is called the Sykes-Picot agreement, and it's sure that the American military intervention in Iraq has totally, you know, destabilized the area, and is the prime factor which explained the rise of ISIS. So we can explain that in the historical perspective of colonization, decolonization, neocolonialization, neocolonialism, if we want. But we have local actors, you know. The fact that the Sunni Arabs are in a state precisely of political alienation is a factor which is not just a mechanical consequence of the American intervention. Now, there is a regional political logic. The local actors are not proxies of the superpowers or the former colonial powers. I will not see, I may be wrong, I don't see Russia as a kind of neo-colonial superpower. I think it's more some sort of regional actor in a sense. And it's an important player, but it's not it's not Russia which is a decision maker in a sense. So the actual logic, the Bashar al-Assad regime, the Iranians, the Kurds, the Turks, the Arab Sunnis, the government of Baghdad, and so on. So they are now in a political regional logic. And if we all agree to think that history, and specifically colonial and post-colonial history, have, of course, shaped, this situation now, I think we should now find other tools of explanation for the evolution, if I can say that, of the conflict. In this perspective, there is, I have a question, which is not for you, it's for me also. Why did ISIS fail? Take another place I know, Afghanistan, with the Taliban. The Taliban have been unable to retake the power in Afghanistan. But, they have been able to stay as a military and political actor and to make any solution impossible without them. We have to negotiate. Anybody will have to negotiate with the Taliban. Why? Because the Taliban have, I would say, they accept some basic concept of international relations. They accept the concept of border. They accept the concept of state. They accept the concept of international relations, of negotiations, and so and so. So they don't want, they never proclaim a caliphate. They just wanted to have the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So, and so it's negotiable, because they play in, I would say, the Westphalian territorial framework. Why was ISIS unable or unwilling to play like that? Why ISIS was never put on the table something which I would not say would be acceptable, but would be negotiable, would have allowed ISIS to appear, as a regional political actor. And once it's not critique on your book; it's a question. I wonder. So that's for the regional dimension. And the second and last point is the global dimension. Of course, as you mentioned, in length, it's not mentioning as you analyze, in length and in depth. ISIS took the model of Al-Qaeda and has improved, but to the perfection, the model of Al-Qaeda. And I would say if we look some years ago, as you mentioned also, some decades ago, we can see that this concept, of a global militant youth vanguard, was in a sense put on the table by the Mohammad-Mahmoud group, when they organized the first global plane jacking, fighting on different places, calling, for the youth, because it was a youth movement here and there. So we see that we don't have here Quranic roots, neither to Al-Qaeda or to ISIS. But ISIS has pushed the model to its base. And you have some concept, which I like, graphic. It's kind, it's global choreography. That's something which is very relevant. Remixing violence, and so. The way ISIS used what I call the aesthetics of cruelty, based on global culture. And you mentioned a lot. That's the best inventory, I think, of the references, the aesthetic references of ISIS in your book. Which are, of course, most of these products are Americans, but I would say it's a global youth culture now. You find that in Japan, in China, everywhere. And it's clear by all the inquiries we did that this aesthetics of violence played a big role in the decision of many youth to join Daesh. Now, what is the part of this aesthetics? What is the part of more political kind of mobilization? You use the term alienation, rebelling against alienation. Alienation is a central concept. The problem I have, and especially with your post-colonial reference, is that beyond this, mobilization on a very articulate narrative, we don't have a social movement. We don't have any kind of popular movements, softer. I would say we don't have soft ISIS. We had soft Marxist. We have soft Nazi, if I can say. We have soft populist. The second tier, the people who are not as radical as the vanguard, but we still consider that to a certain extent the vanguard is representing them, is pushing their grievances, and is fighting their enemies. So with a communist movement, any kind, I would say, of radical movement, global movement we had until now, we found that, writers, for instance, who write novels and things like that, or make speeches saying, okay, I don't belong to this group, they're going a bit too far, but, they put real issues on the table, I understand them, and so. We have very little of that, and it's a bit difficult to say that, in a sense, they ISIS embody a global alienation, a global frustration against the world order and things like that. ISIS remain, for me, the global ISIS, I'm not referring to the regional ISIS, global ISIS, remain a youth movement. And it's not so much, or it's more complicated than, the revolt of the second generation Muslim migrants. We know that the second generation Muslim migrants is are the biggest percentage, and they represent the biggest percentage of people who join ISIS. But everywhere we have 25% of converts. And these converts are not all people who are alienated for different social, racial, or other reasons. Moreover, we have, and here what I'm saying is a bit, tentative, because, but we have, I would say, a growing disconnect between the people who join ISIS and the social reality. For instance, take Great Britain. At the beginning, most of the radicals were either converts, with half of the converts being blacks, if you can say, and most of them were from South Asia. It's no more the case. We still have converts, the same proportion, but less and less people from South Asia. And more, you see people from the margins. New commerce, one Libyan, one Chechen, one Jamaican, some Tunisians, Moroccans in London. So we have a growing disconnect between what we could call the underclass, the modern underclass, and the self-declared vanguard. And once again, we don't have soft ISIS nowhere. We don't have movements who share the ideas or some of the ideas without sharing precisely what makes ISIS so particular, this aesthetic of violence. So still we have this problem, of about the roots of radicalization and what I call the nihilistic dimension. The term is not so good, nihilist. I agree perfectly on that. I have no other term in mind for now. But it may have something to do with my first question. Why did ISIS fail?
Thank you very much, Olivier. Thank you for these comments, which are very well taken, and I agree with a lot of what you said. I would say there's the two questions you raised, which I'll come back to, but you said a couple of things I'd like to comment on. I think you rightly pointed out to a problem we have in this discussion, which is that there's a language that has emerged that has really overtaken a lot of this. You mentioned radicalization, extremism, all of these terms that have become a certain kind of a phraseology, terminology that is both a policy one, and that we can understand. That's the province of policy making, but they have found their ways through research projects, through all manners of things in academia, and they're not really questioned. I can think of only one project these days that is questioning that language itself, led by a colleague of ours. This whole notion of de-radicalization has become a given. And I think these terms have, as I said, stunned us into following, and I don't think that's the role of academia. So that is certainly something that I would agree with. On something else you said, which I think is very important, is in terms of, obviously, it's a political entity. I mean, you gathered as much. I don't think, to make it simple, I don't think the Islamic State, paradoxically, is not a religious entity. It's a political one. It's a socio-political one that uses religion, and it may take that quite seriously, as its ideology, like in any ism, like a communism, like an anarchism, like a nihilism, like an Islamism. That's what it does. Fill in the blanks with the ism. But if we only stay there, and as most analysts unfortunately do, and that's a statement of fact, with only taking for granted that which they say, we're not doing our job. We have to hear that, we have to take that into our lab, then we have to assess it against other things. How important is it? How relevant is it? And by the way, how religious is ISIS if you compare to other Islamist actors that may or may not be as violent, including Al-Qaeda, for instance, as such. In terms of its longer-term approach, so I think I agree. I mean, you have the regional and the global. I think it's a little bit more sort of segmented. I see that there's parts that are both domestic, regional, and internationalized. I think I speak of this back and forth all the time. It's very hard to say where some of these actors coming from Marseille, whether they actually, once they're in Raqqa or in Mosul, once they behave, once they go there, they really don't know the place. They don't even know the language sometimes. They don't know the references. Then what are they really after? They want to go back home. They want to punish that state, which is their state, by the way. It's very difficult to see where the separation is. And that's why I speak of a hybrid puzzle in that sense. The point I wanted to make is that I think we have to speak of ISIS in the plural. We think of it in the singular, right? But I think we have to really ultimately think of it in a plurality. 7, 8, 14, whatever you want to add as identities. I think we have to embrace that multiplicity of identities and as such. The second point I want to make is looking forward, I think down the road, to this question about the representation, the choreography. I think the flag of ISIS itself will become more important than ISIS itself. The sampling, and I use these terms on purpose, that somebody will use that, conduct an attack. But is it really ISIS, or is it somebody claiming to do that? We don't really know. The investigations in the recent attacks are not so clear. But the fact that they claim that identity because of its name, because of its threatening power, I think is central to this discussion. Somebody like Koulibaly, for instance, with the Kouachi brothers, not even clear that he was sent by ISIS. We know that the elder Kouachi brother was certainly with Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. He himself said so to a journalist from BFM. He's on record for that. But does the other fellow, was he really sent by ISIS? Does it even matter, fundamentally, as long as the violence is produced there? I agree on the regional assessment of Russia, all of these actors. I think it's really become a game, a sort of a real geopolitics game as such. I like very much your question of why ISIS fell. Actually, I asked myself the same question when this accelerated thing happened, because it had all of the elements for resilience. It was doing what ISIS did better on a global scale, nastier, more violent. And so you could think that that would have generated a little bit more resilience. I don't know, but listening to you, I could think of 3 or 4 things. I think that there was a contradiction when they adopted territoriality. See, bin Laden was embracing transnationalism, right? So the moment you go back to الدولة الإسلامية and to في العراق وفي الشام, so you are adopting contiguity, which is perfect for a military that needs coordinates to attack you, much like the movements going into Bamako from the north. Once they go back to this evanescence in the great desert or in the great virtual space, it's much more difficult. It's a nightmare for any military in that sense. So I think there's a contradiction between territoriality and transnationality. Can they have it both ways? I doubt. And I think that is one of their Achilles' heel. Secondly, they did not manage diversity so well. Once you have, 35 countries from 35,000 people from 80 countries, those are the UN numbers, how do you manage that on a day-to-day basis in the leadership, which thirdly, they didn't really have. Baghdadi was not a great leader, if he's even still alive and if he was directing this. Bin Laden was charismatic, was central. He spoke and he was saying what he wanted, and nobody dared question him, even now. Baghdadi was a ruthless street thug that was beheading, that was violent in the manner that could generate that power, but he was not necessarily going to inspire a generation to last more than 3 or 4 years. So just ideas that I thought we could add to that good question of yours. And finally, I actually use the terms, and I agree with you, they have limitations, nihilist, anarchists. I use these terms, ladies and gentlemen, and Olivier, because I think that we don't see enough of this back and forth historically between the terrorists of the 19th century, the 20th century, we mentioned the 70s, and today. We like to think of these guys as the most recent, these Arabs and these Muslims, right? These Muhammads, I can say that I have 3 Muhammads in my name, that have doing all of this stuff, right? But then when you actually think about these other guys, that they are different, it's a whole other thing. Well, no, it is terrorism, it's violence. And we can look at the social drivers of that. And yes, I think the counter order of the anarchists and the power of the nihilists, I think, can tell us a few things about ISIS with the limitations of that. So yeah, I think I would follow you on that.
Any counter answer or otherwise?
Well, the problem now is the future. The future.
Oh, the future. Yes,
Yeah. Because so there are many. There is a debate also. You know, we have these guys who call themselves jihadologists. You know, it's a new discipline now. You have to add that. We have the crusadologist sometimes, you know. And if you are not a member of the club, you know, you are not allowed to speak about jihad and crusade and all that. So they have a problem with the disappearance of the object of the research, you know. It's why we should always stay as a generalist. Yeah? When you are too specialized on something, and if the something disappeared, you are lost. So that's advice for future researchers. So the debate is the jihadologists think that jihad is still there. Now, that, okay, ISIS has suffered defeat, but they are still there. So any times we hear about a clash in the Syrian desert, then you have the headlines, ISIS is back, we told you, and so on and so on. And the equivalent is about the sleeping cells, you know. You know, there is a great threat of jihad because we have sleeping cells. They are sleeping very well, by the way, but it's another story. And waiting for the big thing, you know, a new 9/11 or a new Bataclan, and so on and so on. What we see, but of course we lack distance, you know, in terms of time, is that the attacks are more and more individuals and improvised, you know. And sometimes, as you said, you know, the police wait for to be sure that the guy said Allah Akbar. If he didn't say Allah Akbar, it's not terrorism, you know, because it's not Islam. No. If he says Allah Akbar, okay, it's Islamic terrorism. No. But many of these guys are drunk or people who are a bit schizophrenic or so. They may have or not have connection, that's another debate. But still, the impression, you know, is that this kind of appeal for jihad is a bit running out of steam. But once again, you know, we don't really know. Then the fascination and the reasons, the alienation, is still there. You know? The police is still finding, you know, a lot of people who wrote apologies for ISIS on their Facebook page. Or now people are a bit more cautious. You know, they use other means than their daily Facebook page. But still, the fascination is there. So, are we, you know, in the wake of diminishing phenomena? The same way, for instance, that we saw with the extreme left in the 70s, in the 80s, yes, we had still assassination, attacks, you know, bank robbery, but the number was decreasing, and the cells were more and more isolated, and you know, relying on few people without few logistics. Where will the people who have good reasons to be fascinated by Daesh, by ISIS, where will they go? You know? And what is the future of the regional Islamic Emirates? Yeah. Are they small ISIS, or is it quite different? Are they closer to the Taliban model, yeah. Or, you know, I don't know what, you know, what is your perspective on that?
Thank you. I'm happy to entertain these with the proviso that I think we should always resist the crystal ball game, which is one of the things that the policymaker always asks for. Give us scenarios, give us actionable options, give us contingency plans. That's a different exercise. I think what we have to look at, I insist on this, the ability of we don't know. But then again, once we said that, we can look at patterns and we can identify a few things which I'm happy to discuss with you. I think, first of all, the history of terrorism is always one, it's mathematical, it's ups and downs. It's the terms used in the literature is waves, generations, cycles, ages. These are the different terms that we have. So certainly a revival logic is there, particularly if the product and ISIS, Al-Qaeda, ISIS were products. If the branding and the product was powerful, so someone down the road, somewhere in this world will come back with the notion of the real Al-Qaeda, like the real IRA we had at some point, or the Islamic State of Canada or the US, fill in the blanks, kind of transpose that, remix, use that. So I think there will be a lot of this, which is reappropriation in unexpected places. Africa for sure, Asia certainly. We've seen movements in Brazil around the time of the World Cup, the previous one, in 2014, if you recall, or the Olympic Games, sorry, sort of threatening to become ISIS and so on. So once it's available as a commodity, it can always be used for whatever's local purposes. The second big trend that I see is the lineage and the rebirth that could come in an entity like Al-Qaeda, which is internal. Hamza bin Laden, for instance, has been quite active, 4 or 5 messages over the past 2 years. His whole life, this is the son of bin Laden, his whole life, he's born in '88, if I recall. So you have a logic of a certain lineage, a certain authority that can appeal to some of these actors, for sure. That is something, and he's reported to be somewhere in Syria or somewhere working, and that is a possibility there. But doesn't have to be him, it could be adopted anywhere. Earlier, you said something about the second generation being made too much of. I agree. I think what the real issue now is the third generation that is a mix of these guys. I was looking, there's an attack in July 2016 that was led by a fellow named Abdel Malik Petitjean. And I think that's the future. This is exactly what you're going to, Abdel Malik Petitjean. I mean, it's a perfect mix of 2 traditions, 2 regions, you see the logic of how this very notion of interaction, marriage in this case, sort of the biology of it, the cultural mixity is going to produce things that will move on that front as such. In the United States of America, for instance, we have a whole segment of the population now that racism is coming back with the African Americans issues that is very much increasingly going to be, is already alienated. And we've seen violence of that nature in the 1970s. So an influence there could become present on things that are completely different. Those are about civil rights and about representation and about citizenship, but that is certainly something that we could see. As at the same time that KKK and right-wing terrorism is rising and putting this underclass, as you said, against each other. And finally, I could not agree more on the criticism of the jihadology as it emerges. Analysts that are not necessarily looking at the bigger jihad, by the way, which is on oneself, if one knows Islam, but always the smaller jihad for that matter. But I think these neologisms are problematic. As you point out, they're about a turf. It's about essentially a business. You know, let's call it what it is. And I think they get in the way of things that are too important to be left at this level of improvisation. So the future seems to me quite open. I see certainly at some point a revival, rebirth, reappearance, reemergence of either one of these two, ISIS or Al-Qaeda, domestically or regionally. But I see more importantly the global influence at the level of the youth, alienated, rebellious, and frustrated for whatever reason, economically, socially, culturally. And that could be quite a powerful segment today that terrorism is very much kind of democratized, privatized. And we've seen that in many of these attacks of the past 2 years.
Thank you very much, Professor Mohamedou. Thank you much, Professor Roy. Thank you really for, I mean, I think one of the very interesting and striking characteristic of your presentation is this capacity of putting, connecting things. And in terms of analyzing the phenomenon, I was, over the past few years, always a bit disturbed by the fact that many of the theories are the way ISIS has been analyzed was looking at part of the phenomenon and almost automatically excluding the others. As if looking at this would make it impossible to look at the other dimension. And I think you do it very, very well, reconnecting these different dimensions and giving sense to the whole phenomenon, looking at the various angles. And I think this is something that is very, very, very interesting experience.